Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne. With me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, we've reached the 90s.
That's pretty exciting. Started way back in the early 60s, and now we are just about at the year 2000, which means we're just about 21st century, which means we're just about done. I think that's how it works. So,
don't think that's quite it, but yeah, we've come a long way, and we've got a lot going on this year from the looks of things.
Yeah, this is a big one. This is a crazy year, and it's a crazy year, really. Not only all across the world, but specifically with Marvel Comics. Because as we start the 90s, both Marvel and DC are sort of approaching this monopoly status on comic book shelves. At this point, they've left most other publishers to look for success sort of at the margins. There's a few that are still surviving on newsstands, some that are able to make a sort of meager living on a few copies here and there at the stores. So if you're a fan of the big two, 1990 is an absolutely great time to be reading comic books. If for some reason you are not a fan of the big two, you might want to go and check out a different bookstore or something like that, because it was a rough time. It really was. I'm kind of amazed, in fact, just how rough a time it was.
All right. Before we jump in and start talking about that, we mentioned that we were looking at possibly changing our release schedule. These episodes have been getting longer and longer as we've been getting closer and closer to 1990, where we are now. And we asked a couple weeks ago if you would be okay if we split the episodes in two. And I think that's what's got to happen, given what it seems like we're running into as far as what we want to talk about. There's just not enough time to do it in one episode.
Yeah, we've had a couple of folks who we visited with said they'd at least be willing to give it a try. They haven't minded it when they've been split in two. The other interesting thing is we're still going to record them as a single episode. So there should still be that organic sort of movement from comics to Marvel to Daredevil that we have tried to cultivate. It's just that we're going to take an intermission in the middle of it that we wouldn't have normally taken as far as publishing, so that you'll get half of it one week and half the next. I think one of the things about this that's interesting is, as we head to the 90s and then the 2000s, I had started to see that just the number of publishers, the number of comics starts to explode as we especially head into the 2000s. And there's really some point, once you get some of the movie references and some of the other things in culture, this was going to happen anyways. We'd have a crazy, it'd be 2 hours every week. And so I think it's good to get it done now, kind of get this sorted out while we are at the tail end of the 90s, where a lot of the media tie-ins and stuff like that still aren't at their highest flower. And we'll just kind of make sure that we try to make sure we keep this still feeling as much like it's linear as we can, even while we're splitting them into two parts.
Definitely. It also helps me keep ahead of all the comic books we're reading, and hopefully I'll be able to branch out and look at some of the other books besides the main timeline. And we're going to have where the Daredevil's going to have multiple books coming out every month. And so there's going to end up being more books that I'm going to try and have to read for a given year. And this is going to give me a little bit extra time to do that, which is very mumuch appreciated, especially since I'm going to be potentially moving here this month. Into the house that was done months ago, but we couldn't actually move in yet. So we got that going for us.
Very cool. Yeah,
all right.
I think it should be exciting. And you are correct. There are a lot of times in the next couple of years, especially into the late 90s, where we'll have 2 or 3 Daredevil titles in a single year.
So before we jump in, we talk about the year in comics. Dan, you want to set the stage for us and what's going on kind of in the world a little bit, some of the things that are going on in the US specifically that maybe then feed into what we end up seeing in the comics, both comics at large and then maybe more specifically in Marvel and Daredevil, when we get to those subjects.
There's just a lot of things going on in the United States in 1990 that are long-term, big-picture things that have left effects. I think that, one of the things to keep in mind is that early in the year, the United States invades Panama. And this is that to take out Manuel Noriega type of thing. We have the Exxon Valdez crash with all of the oil spilling out and then the ecological destruction of that. Across the country, because of economic problems that America had been having, and especially for lower class folks who've been hurt by a lot of the Reaganomics stuff, you had increased poverty and increased drug use. There was a number of things that were starting to happen in New York, for instance. Crack cocaine had become to really be a problem in New York, and also had a number of other things. So they had the highest homicide rate in the history of the city, either before or since, in the years 1989 and 1990. I think you're going to start to see some of that when we talk about the Daredevil comics, that Nascenti really hits on some of the problems that New York is having, both in terms of attempts to sort of, change New York and change America, really, with this idea that more and more high rises, fewer and fewer places for normal people to live, that sort of thing. You've got all sorts of strikes going on. You've got a lot of labor problems, including the fact that Major League Baseball actually tried the lockout against their players in 1990. Now, this is not the big strike that'll come in 94, but it's kind of the precursor to that. There are a ton of things going on. And I think the main thing to keep in mind with the comics that we're seeing is, there are so many reasons why Americans are starting to sort of lose their trust in their government and become a little bit uneasy. And comic books really take to that. And we're going to see a lot of that coming out here. So we'll talk about some of that as we go along. Also in the world, Soviet Union's falling apart. This is the year that Yeltsin takes over from Gorbachev. The Soviet Union will actually be dissolved next year, but it's already on its way down now. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the world because of that. It's just kind of some crazy stuff going on. And then closer to home, the merger between Time Warner and Time Incorporated and Warner Communications is completed this year. So TC's parent company officially becomes Time Warner as of 1990. So
that's
some stuff.
That's a lot of things going on.
There's a lot going on, man. It was a crazy year. Year
All
for
right.
the history books.
Let's jump in and let's see what that then looks like when we look at the year in comics. The year in comics. All right, Dan, it's 1990. All that stuff is going on in the world and in the U.S. Where do we begin when we're looking at the year in comics? Obviously, typically we start with DC and what they're doing. Obviously, post-merger now. What's going on?
Well, first, just to set the stage. Normally, we've got the rest of the comic world, and then we talk about Marvel. Now it would actually be more appropriate to talk about Marvel and then talk about what's going on in that paltry little rest of the comic world. Because as of this year, Marvel sold over 155 million comics and comic-type magazines for a total of around 50% of all of the comics that were sold in the United States during the year. So in 1990, this is the first time actually took a full half of the entire domestic comic book market just to itself. Interestingly enough, they're going to blow that away next year. So this is not their high. They're not done eating the market yet. But it is still really impressive. DC comes in second with a third of the market. And they're doing really cool stuff. But they get about a third. Meaning that 5 out of every 6 comics sold in America is either a DC or a Marvel comic.
Wow. That is a staggering amount.
Yeah, and it is really, they are just sucking the oxygen out from the others intentionally, because they just keep flooding the zone with so many books that it's difficult for anybody else to really keep up. So, let's see how they did that, shall we? DC starts out, first of all, with a number of big sort of changes for existing characters. Probably the biggest story of the year, from the biggest character in comic books, is that Clark Kent, after something like, 53 years or something, finally gets up the nerve to ask Lois Lane to marry him. And she says yes. So, interestingly, he has not yet actually told her that he's Superman. That comes next year. But she actually did agree to marry him. We have some changes to the Batman world in that the new Robin 3, or Tim Drake, actually officially becomes Robin and gets his costume. This costume, actually, Neil Adams won a design contest to design the costume. Got something like $10,000 or something to design this costume. And he did it in a way that was a lot more sort of, at least adolescent rather than childish. So they're making Robin a little older, and he's not running around in the little green pants anymore and whatever. Now he's got like a regular, like a bigger cape that's got black on the outside so he can hide a little bit. He's got like long, normal kind of black pants, and it's a much less sort of goofy, much less campy costume. We have a number of other things that are interesting in that DC does a Batman book called Digital Justice. It's actually another of these computer comics. The big difference is that Pepe Moreno is actually a really, really good artist. And he spent a couple of years learning to use the Mac specifically to be able to do this. And he hand did everything. But it's really interesting. I would have been happier if he'd just drawn it, to be quite frank, because he's a good artist. And so why you would go and translate everything through a mouse when you could have just drawn it doesn't make any sense. But it was cool. It didn't sell particularly well. It was expensive, and there were other things maybe for folks to buy. But it was interesting. We had the Flash TV show debuting with John Wesley Shipp. Amanda Pays is in it as well. And eventually we get Mark Hamill playing the Trickster. So this was a cool show. I actually enjoyed this show. The budget was one of the highest budgets for a TV show of the early 90s. It actually really was a good retelling of The Flash. One problem was that they modeled at least to me, one of the problems though, was that they modeled the Flash suit off of the Batman suit for Burton's Batman. And if you think that it seems weird having somebody who's supposed to be Batman who barely can move in his suit, imagine if it's supposed to be the Flash who's like running everywhere in a suit that he can't hardly move in. So I think they could have done the suit a little differently, but it was still cool. Lasted about a season and a half, something like that. Cool thing, we actually went to a convention a couple of years ago where John Wesley Shipp was speaking. And Sienna, my daughter, got to ask him some questions and get a picture with him, and can confirm he seems to be just a really, really cool dude. So my opinion of the Flash TV show is even better now, because I like the lead actor quite a lot. He went on to also play Jay Garrick in the Flash TV show of the Arrowverse later as well. So he came back. And has continued to be in comic stuff as well.
I have not seen that TV show. I am familiar with John Wesley Shipp, though, and he does seem like a good guy, and so that's great hearing that he is that good a
Yep.
guy in person and not just
At least he
what
was in
seems
that
to be.
panel. He was a super good dude. Yeah, the first season of that Flash TV show in like the 2010s, I think is one of the best comic book adaptations ever done in any format.
Huh.
It hits the Flash perfectly. Now there's varying levels of quality as the Arrowverse continues, but that first season of the Flash was just dead solid perfect. Outside of that, Lobo, actually, after debuting in Omega Men a few years ago, he actually gets his own book from Giffen and then somebody named Simon Bisley, who came over from England and has this really sort of crazy, anarchic sort of style that was perfect for Lobo. The problem is that this is sort of that dark and gritty, just almost like nihilistic element of the 90s starting up. Lobo is a character who becomes one of the most popular characters in DC in the 90s. And his origin story is that he is the last survivor of his planet because he himself personally killed everybody else on his planet.
Oh.
So he is a genocidal mass murderer.
Oh my goodness.
Who became one of DC's best sellers and a fan favorite. So that was a little disturbing when you think of it.
Yeah.
He is basically Thanos, only played for laughs on a big motorcycle, and has pretty much the ability to stand against Superman. So,
well, okay then.
But I've never actually been able to get into Lobo. I'm not into the nihilistic side of comics. I know that there are times that if I didn't have to think about the history of the character, I would like the adventures, because he is kind of an interesting character in the stories a lot of times. I can't get past the backstory.
Sure.
So
that's a pretty rough backstory to have to get over. Not have
does make
pop
him,
into
for
your
me
head.
at least, difficult to cheer for him.
Yeah.
Maybe they've retroed that sometime in the last however long, but at least the last time I read, that was the story. We had some new Sandman stories this year. Early in the year, we had the end of the first arc of Sandman from Neil Gaiman, which had the debut of a character called the Corinthian. Did you watch the Sandman series on Netflix?
I have not watched it yet.
So he's a serial killer with like teeth for eyes. He's one of the freakiest characters ever. So again, when Sandman was being sort of like pitched, and I'm like, oh, Sandman's going to be coming, that'll be fun. And I was literally talking to my wife, and I said, the only thing I hope is that in the first season, they find something else to do than Corinthian, because that guy freaks me out, and I don't want to have to watch Corinthian's story. And it turns out Corinthian appears to be the main bad guy of the entire first season of the Sandman TV show. So I haven't finished it.
Yeah.
He's scary as hell. Anyways, but then later in the year, they did a story called A Midsummer Night's Dream. It was Neil Gaiman and Charles Vess, which actually won something called the World Fantasy Award for short stories for 1990. This is the first time that a comic book actually took home a major literary prize that was not a category for comic books, right?
Sure. Okay.
So it actually got a literary prize that said, and it wasn't like a special award for comic books that are, hitting above their weight or whatever. There's like, this is the best short story of the year. And so this was a big moment for comic books. It's also a really, really cool story. And it's not short necessarily. It's the span of a single comic issue. But that would be the equivalent for these folks of a short story, they called it. And that is one that if you haven't read it, it's mostly standalone. You kind of got to know a little bit about some of the main Sandman characters, but not much. It is well worth reading. It's actually a lot of fun. So, outside of that, we had DC doing the Books of Magic, which essentially was a almost strict copy of Harry Potter, even down to the fact that it's a sort of young kid who goes to a magic school and has a like a little lightning bolt on his forehead. The only difference is it was done about a half a decade before Harry Potter, which
Oh,
lends you
really?
to wonder. Yes, so the grand question has always been, what did J.K. Rowling know and when did she know it? How much of the Books of Magic had she seen that would have made its way into Harry Potter? But nonetheless, call it just parallel development, I guess, if you want. So,
Sure.
in any case, the original Books of Magic were actually a lot of fun. They've continued doing those into the future. It actually deals with a number of different sort of magic users across the DC universe. DC also did some unusual things through their Piranha imprint. One of them was called Why I Hate Saturn by Kyle Baker. Baker has this really crazy, interesting art style, and that would certainly be something that is interesting to read as well. He sometimes takes some getting used to, but this was actually really popular. It went through a bunch of reprints and is a much celebrated story. And then also Enemy Ace, War Idol by George Pratt, which the story is that I got in one of the books that I was reading that evidently Pratt did this, and it's based on Enemy Ace, who is a Joe Kubert character from back in the day that was one of his classic characters. And it's a beautiful story. It's an interesting story. It basically talks about how the Baron goes from being sort of like this patriotic ace to a disillusioned former pilot to somebody who then sort of fights against or is against a lot of the combat that he sees. And it didn't sell that well, but it did actually get Pratt noticed by Kubert himself, who then gave him a job at his art institute. So it was a brilliant addition for a job, if nothing
Sure.
else.
Yeah.
So, outside of DC, we do have a few cool things going on. Dark Horse actually was one of the biggest ones in terms of this year. They had a number of Aliens, Predators, and Aliens versus Predators comics that came out. And in fact, I believe it was the Aliens comic. It might have been the Predators one. One of these actually was selling at levels that were competitive with like X-Men or Batman comics. So these were some of the most popular comics on the stand right now. Were some of these licensed sort of horror movie adaptations. And these aren't adaptations of the movies. They're actually new stories in the Aliens universe or the Predators universe that they've continued on outside of the movies. We also had a couple other things by Dark Horse. Give Me Liberty by Frank Miller and Dave Gibbons, and Hard Boiled, again by Frank Miller and Jeff Darrow. Give Me Liberty is the story of Martha Washington, who is kind of a young pilot in a dystopian future. And then Hard Boiled is this just crazy, almost like a Sin City-esque type story. But Jeff Darrow's artwork is this sort of European style, super detailed artwork. Like if you look at the cover for one of the Hard-Boiled books, there's a guy standing and crashing a car, and you can literally see like all of the little objects that were sitting in the back seat of the car are like flying through the air, and they're all perfect and delineated, and everything is just a disaster, but it's beautifully rendered. So both of those books were super successful and actually were really good. So Miller actually was a busy man this year because he had Elektra and he had So yeah, Miller was a busy man because he had not only his Elektra series, but he also had Give Me Liberty and he had Hard Boiled. So 3 very, very different stories. One he drew himself, 2 he had other artists. They look completely different. You'd never known they were written or collaborated on by the same guy if you saw the 3 separately. But there you go. He was a bit of a chameleon at this point. His collaborators made a huge difference in what he would do.
Sure.
Jim Shooter, you may have remembered him from back in the day.
Yes.
He actually returns with his own company. After not getting Marvel Comics, the folks that he had worked with to try and put the bid for that together kind of continued on with him, and they formed a new company called Valiant, which is actually going to go on to be a big part of 90s comic books. A couple other books. The Hobbit is one of the books that was adapted by Eclipse this year. I really enjoyed that one. It's like a full, almost like painted kind of adaptation of Tolkien's The Hobbit. They started doing a number of like Classics Illustrated type of book adaptations. Men in Black, which is a comic book series that the movie Men in Black was based on, came out this year. Comic book was not met with a lot of fanfare, I don't think, but because of that, they're extremely expensive now. If you go out and try and buy these, they were relatively low printing, and I don't think they were ever reprinted as far as the originals. So they've got some value now. They were published by a company called Aircell, which is one of the smaller publishers. It's kind of an offshoot of one of the other ones. Peter Baggy started a series called Hate this year. This is through Fantagraphics. And this is actually going to win a lot of awards. It's basically about just this really, really dysfunctional, disgruntled dude who goes around just being a dumbass. And it's pretty hilarious, and it's pretty sad, and it really is a pretty amazing story. So I actually just picked up a couple additional issues of Hate this weekend at the flea market. I saw some in the wild, which does not happen very often. So that was kind of cool. I've only read a few of these because they were kind of hard to get back in the day. Fantagraphics also was making, for the most part, not enough money publishing stuff like Hate, that they actually started a new imprint called Eros Comics this year, which essentially just published comic book pornography. And that is what they used to then supplement, for a while, the publishing of their more like high-end, art comic type of comic books was the was the Eros line. So yeah, I guess they do what they got to do. Kevin Eastman had made hundreds of millions of dollars off the Turtles, and so he decided to start giving back by creating something called Tundra Publishing, which it turns out, I believe, is one of the worst run companies in the history of comic books.
Oh, no.
It took a massive amount of funding and basically just squandered it completely with very little to show for it. But he's a good guy. I like Kevin Eastman.
Sure.
So we also have Chris Oliveros starting Drawn and Quarterly. If Jim Shooter starts the big superhero universe for the year, Chris Oliveros Drawn and Quarterly is going to be probably one of the most important small publishers of comics. So when you talk about sort of the prestige imprints, a lot of the ones that most people have never heard of their primary creators or the books they do, it will be Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly. And there's some fantastic stuff that's come out from those two publishers. But a lot of it is a lot more experimental, a lot less commercial. They definitely do not have any kind of just, standard superhero cape type stuff. It is all just very different from what you'd see in the big two. So, so really an important thing. Drawn and Quarterly is a fantastic addition to comics, and they've been really important, bringing a lot of cool stuff out. And then, I guess the last thing as far as books for this year, there was one that I would say got away. It's one that I got the first couple books of this, and I was puzzled beyond belief, but also excited. Regular listeners will know we're big Sienkiewicz fans here. And this year, he and Alan Moore, two of the top creators at the time, got together to do a new story called Big Numbers. It was a 10 by 10, almost like a record-sized, maybe a little smaller than a record-sized comic that was specifically done to be sort of different than what else was going on in the market. It was going to be 12 issues. Sienkiewicz was going to do the whole thing. It was going to be about fractals and chaos theory, and basically it was going to be a math class, only sort of on heavy drugs with a mystery story in there someplace. Right?
Wow, okay.
And and we only got 2 of them. So the 2 I
Oh,
have are the only 2 I'm ever going to get, because there evidently is a third one I found out there someplace that was like photocopied onto the internet or something like this, that mostly was finished. But essentially, Sienkiewicz got behind. They tried to bring on somebody else to do it. He got depressed or couldn't finish it, and it just sort of drifted away.
oh
So
no.
I don't know if Moore's story was just too heady for even the most crazy artists to actually find a way around it, or what happened. But big numbers. Still a really cool book. If you get a chance to look through one, they are fantastic. But do not try to read it for 2 reasons. Number one, it makes no sense for the most part. And number two, if you get invested in the story, well, you're never going to be able to finish
Never
it.
gonna
So
get
what's
the
the
end,
point?
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about like the industry, some trends that are going on, statistics. It looks like the price of comics is going up again.
Yeah, we haven't talked about this every week as it happens, but I think the last time I mentioned it, we were at like 45 to 60 cents or something. Almost all comics are now at least $1, with a lot of them at $1.50, and a lot of the independent ones being even higher than that, right around maybe 175 to $2. So for instance, your average Daredevil comic right now is going to run you about $1. Moon Knight is still in kind of special paper and everything else like that, and it is actually 150. And then a lot of the stuff that would be like these, new books that are coming out from Eclipse or whatever, they're going to be more in the area of 175 to $2. So books continue to get expensive,
Yeah.
and there's no end in sight. Also, there's more and more that are sort of the premium format ones. A lot of things like that, the um, the graphic the digital graphics one or whatever, the Batman story, that was like $25. I think that Arkham Asylum last year was $25. So a lot of the more sort of high end prestige books are really out of the price range of a lot of regular readers. So it's a little bit crazy sometimes.
So what's going on at the newsstand then?
You still see Archie. You still see cartoon stuff like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Cartoon is now turned into a comic book. So this isn't the grungy turtles of the early or the mid '80s. This is sort of the turtles that were in the comic books. Um, you're going to have a bunch of Marvel and DC's books still out there, and of course, if you're a collector, I guess we've never really mentioned this, but there are 2 versions of pretty much every Marvel and DC comic book for most of the '80s and into the '90s, and that is the newsstand edition and the direct sales edition. Maybe
Oh,
we have mentioned this, but
huh.
in the lower corner, you're either going to have a UPC symbol, which is what you've got if it goes to the newsstand so that the supermarkets can scan it, or
Right.
if it goes to the direct market, because most of the direct market stores at this time are still completely uncomputerized and backwards. You just have like a Spider-Man's head there. And the reason they do this, and they put the character head instead, is because any of the ones that had the UPC code would be a returnable comic, and any of the ones that have the character head in them instead, where the UPC would be, that indicates that it is a non-returnable direct market sale.
Er.
But because of that fact, and because it's harder and harder to find, especially newsstand copies in really good condition, a lot of times now the newsstand editions of certain Marvel and DC comic books are worth way more money than the direct market edition. And so if you've got some of those that are in really good shape, they can be a little bit valuable. So,
I would also imagine they're maybe not printing as many of those as well.
maybe, but in actual fact, one of the things that keeps the price down is that they did kind of print a lot of them,
Okay.
because they would just roll the presses on those, and then the ones that don't get consumed get like mulched,
Sure.
and the rest. So they still did run pretty high print runs to sell to the newsstands, even though it was not, the return on investment wasn't what it once was, which is why they're gonna cut that down as they go.
It's you mentioned a couple new publishers. Is there any
Yep.
other new publishers you want to mention?
Drawn and Quarterly and Valiant are the big ones, but we got Millennium Publishers, Tundra, AD Vision, Printers Row Publishing, Cha Cha Comics, King Hell, and then Wizard Entertainment, all of which would have at least, I think it was 10 or 12 titles that they would do overall. So none of these are immediate fly-by-nights, but really Wizard and the first two are the only ones that I think are going to stick around for a long time. No, that may be not true. Tundra is going to be around for a while. Anyways, we also have some problems on the other side, though. Now Comics, which has been going for quite a while, filed for bankruptcy this year. First Comics stopped publishing monthly comic books and started doing a lot of the things that were more like one-shot type of things and albums and the like. And Eclipse was down to just Miracle Man and then some of the things like the Hobbit story and stuff like that. So a lot of our mid-market publishers have essentially collapsed. It really is Dark Horse and the big two, and then a few people just trying to scramble at the margins.
Few
And Dark
niche ones.
Yeah, and Dark Horse is still tiny, but it's tiny with Frank Miller, which makes you less tiny than 1990.
Sure. No, that makes sense. So what is this note about Scott McCloud here as we wrap up?
Oh, that was actually, there's now this thing called the Comic Strip in 24 Hours, which is an event that McCloud has been doing for a while. And it's the idea of essentially drawing a comic in a single day. So if you want to learn more about it, it's still going now, and you can go out to 24hourcomics.com and take a look. And they still are out there going through and doing this, where essentially you have cartoonists get a 24-hour window to make whatever they can for a comic, but you have to make 24 pages of drawn and scripted comic book in 24 hours.
Goodness.
So it's not easy.
That sounds like quite the endeavor.
So
right, let's move on and talk about awards. It looks like the Eisner Awards are back this year. Who were some of the big winners when it came to the Eisners this year?
Yeah, and evidently the previous year, by the way, the reason why they didn't present was that they did all of the voting, and then someone managed to lose the ballots or have a problem with the ballots.
Oh,
and
gosh.
So they didn't present, and the chairman who was managing the tallying of the votes or whatever stepped down and was replaced by the guy who evidently is still in charge of it as of today. So,
okay.
So this year, the Eisner's 4 books released in 1990. It's used to be presented in 91. Concrete actually won one of the best story or single issue. It's Concrete Celebrates Earth Day, and that was Chadwick, Vess, and Mobius. So Paul Chadwick managed to get 2 of the best artists on Earth to hang out and do a Concrete comic with him, and it won him an award. Best Continuing Series, we had Sandman. Best Black and White Series was at Xenozoic Tales. Again, that's the one with the dinosaurs. If you're a dinosaur person, check that out. Best Finite Series, Give Me Liberty by Frank Miller and Dave Gibbons. Which, of course, that's 2 of the guys who basically set the stage for the 90s, in that Miller wrote and drew Dark Knight and Gibbons drew Watchmen. So you put the 2 of them together and there's a good chance you're going to have some success. Best Graphic Album, that was Electra Lives Again by Frank Miller. Best Graphic Album Reprint, Sandman the Doll's House. This was actually essentially like a trade paperback that they did. Gaiman won Best Writer. Best Writer or Artist Team was Miller and Darrow for Hardboiled. Best Artist, Steve Rude on Nexus. And Rude's style on Nexus is really cool. Best Inker, our man, Al Williamson, mostly for his work on Daredevil. And 2 new entrants to the Hall of Fame. We had Robert Crumb, going in as R. Crumb, and Alex Toth. So Crumb is one of the lead figures of the Underground, and Toth, of course, had been doing things in newspapers and comics, I think from the 40s onward. So fantastic style.
Your comment about Watchmen, I had meant to mention this during the pre-show before we jumped in. I know our friend Forrest, who listens to the show, was excited about me reading The Watchmen. I actually picked up The Watchmen this weekend, and I'm going to try and read it over the next couple weeks. So I will probably, we might spend a minute or two talking about The Watchmen at some point once I get done with it. But I do have a copy of it now. So I just, that jumped out to me when you mentioned that there, and I had meant to mention it earlier, but I thought I'd at least mention it now.
Absolutely. Very cool.
All right, before we jump in and start talking about Marvel, Dan, what is your favorite non-Marvel comic from 1990?
So I had so many choices, most of them done by Frank Miller in some way or another, right?
Sure.
As a quick note on the Eisners, Frank Miller somehow managed to win Eisners in 1990 for 3 different series. So all 3 of the series he did,
that's right,
won something or another, which is kind of insane. And we'll talk about Elektra Lives again, but in terms of the ones that aren't Marvel stuff, I really loved Give Me Liberty. So I would agree with the Eisners on the best finite series for Give Me Liberty. I also really enjoyed Hard Boiled, but I think that Give Me Liberty to me was clearly kind of my favorite. And I'm realizing more and more how much in the 80s and 90s, Frank Miller really was just this unstoppable force in comics. The weird thing is 1990 is kind of the year, though, because when you look at Give Me Liberty, it's everything I love about Frank Miller. And when you look at Elektra Lives Again, it's kind of everything I come to hate about Frank Miller. And so this is the year right here. This is the edge of the knife, it seems.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, we've looked outside of the Marvel tent. Now let's dive in and talk about what's going on at Marvel. You said they're doing basically half of the market that's being sold right now is Marvel Comics. That must mean there's a lot of titles, and let's try and keep this under an hour for the Marvel portion of this.
Have you looked at our document yet? Have you looked at our document?
I have. That's what I'm
disaster.
saying. Let's try and keep this rolling here a little bit. So Dan, starting out, how many titles are we talking about here?
As far as I can tell, 186 different titles were published by Marvel in 1990.
Wow.
That includes one-shots and limited series and new series and existing series and whatever else. But 186 different titles in 1 year.
So if I remember right, that eclipses any other year to this point by almost like 20 or 30%.
Yep, that sounds about right. Not that much. I think previously we were in the 150s or maybe something like that. So by about 30. So, no, you're right. That's probably 20-some percent.
20%. Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah.
No wonder my head hurt. No wonder my head hurt trying to get this done. So,
right. So what were they doing in all these titles? I mean. I can't imagine that it's all new stuff, and I can't imagine it's all limited stuff. So what are we seeing here?
Well, I mean, the cool thing is that as Marvel is growing and taking over everything, they are sort of trying to do it in a responsible way to the extent that they can. So what they've been doing is they have this sort of big tent philosophy where they're still publishing kids' comics. They're not doing Star Line anymore because they've decided to use the Marvel brand to its full advantage. But they've still got a bunch of kids' comics that they're doing. They've got sci-fi comics that are more like straight science fiction. They've got things like The Nom. They've got the Gru comics, which are more sort of like, almost like Mad style adult humor. They've got Conan. They've got Steel Town Rockers, which is a book about a bunch of folks trying to put together a rock band that is nothing to do with superheroes at all. They've got Street Poet Ray, which I've never actually read, but I've heard a lot about. It did not last very long. Kind of got mocked a little from the sound of it. But Marvel's got a bunch of stuff going on, and they are doing a lot of different things. The problem is that more and more as they depend on the direct market, a lot of this stuff just doesn't sell there. So like the kids' books and the like doesn't sell at all on the direct market. So they keep getting pushed to contract, even as they're desperately trying to find ways to keep that market sort of broad.
Well,
They also have Ron Perlman and his new philosophy, the guy who just bought the Marvel last year, where what he's trying to do is change the way the Marvel works by making it that mini Disney. And what this really means is that he wants to focus on two things, sort of like big crossovers and events that generate cash, and ways to sort of bring in crossovers and ways to highlight all of their most marketable characters to make them more visible. So the idea is, let's get Spider-Man in front of as many eyeballs as we can, both in Spider-Man comics and in other comics, and then try and find ways to make sure that if somebody's buying 10 books, they really need to buy another 5 just to keep up, because we've got these interactions going.
Interesting, the mini Disney idea, and then
Yep.
eventually Marvel is part of Disney.
Yep. And they're really, but what he wants to do is he wants to get to the point where he is selling toys and he's selling lunchboxes and he's licensing out the characters for movies and TV shows and everything like that. And the idea is that to do that, they've got these really good brands like Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, the Hulk, but they need to make sure that they keep emphasizing those and don't get distracted too much in the Guardians and the Galaxies and stuff like this. That will never be of any use to anyone, so they might as well just give up on them, right?
Of course, yes.
No, Guardians actually, we'll talk about them in a little while. But, so for this year, what that means is we have one of our big crossovers. This one's called The Extinction Agenda. Essentially, there's an island called Genosha where there are a bunch of mutants being held captive. Genosha is going to have a whole story. But at this point, there's mutants being held captive there. The rest of the mutants of the Marvel Universe are heading off to save them. Some of them, of course, end up getting brainwashed and betray the team, and there's big fights and everything like this. But it allows them to get almost all of their mutants and almost all of their mutant comics sort of into one big scrum. We also have the Days of Future Present crossover, which, remember we had our annual crossover? Well, now they've decided to do a crossover that goes through some of the annuals, but then also dips down into some of the books. So if you're buying those books, then you should really buy the annuals of these other books so that you can see what's going on. So all these different ways they're trying to convince people to buy more stuff. They also had one super way to get everybody to buy more stuff, and that's to take one of their most popular artists, which is Todd McFarlane, and put him on one of their most popular characters, Spider-Man, in a book that's got a brand new issue #1 on it. And so, Spider-Man #1, also sometimes called the adjectiveless Spider-Man #1, came out in 1990. It was essentially, McFarlane had been working on Spider-Man titles. People loved him. So they're like, well, let's give him a book. And the weird thing is he'd wanted to write his own book, right? So he's like, Marvel, I like drawing Spider-Man here, but I'd kind of like to have my own book where I can do my own writing and then draw it and everything, and then I don't have to worry about somebody else's scripts. And I think he was expecting, according to him, to be given something like, Heathcliff or Guardians of the Galaxy or something that they wouldn't really care about. And instead they're like, we've been thinking of doing a new Spider-Man title, and here's our most important character, go play. And he's like, I've never written a comic book before, but all right. And so away he goes. Super, super popular. It was a sea change in some ways, because this is one of the first books where you get like 5 full-page spreads. Because McFarlane lets his art just sort of go wild. And a lot of times that means that this is one of those comics that reads in 5 minutes. where it does not take very long at all to get through it because the art is big and flashy and the story's kind of there. He's going to be a lot more careful with his story when he gets to stuff like Spawn, but here it's just sort of like, these are big, bombastic, fun books. The first one, though, sold 3 million copies because partly it was really something people wanted, but then they also came up with the idea of doing variant covers. So they had different covers that they would send to either, like, the direct market got some covers, the newsstand got a different cover, and then certain channels like Walmart would get a different cover as well. So there's like a gold cover for Walmart, a silver cover I think went to maybe to the newsstand, or silver cover went to, I can't remember. But there's 2 or 3 different backgrounds. It's the same issue or image of Spider-Man, but there's different color backgrounds. And so a lot of people then, of course, went out and bought
wanted all of them. Yeah. Wow.
Yep. So that was crazy, but that was the best-selling title of the year by far. Overall, though, this was the year Marvel kind of really put a bunch of stuff together. Like, if you look at the artists and the teams they had on a lot of their books, this is the year Rob Liefeld goes on New Mutants. Mark Silvestri moves on to Wolverine. Jim Lee moves on to X-Men. Valentino moves on to Guardians of the Galaxy. John Byrne is doing Namor, a new Namor book, and Iron Man that year. Walt Simonson is doing Fantastic Four. So you have all of these guys who are some of the biggest names still working in mainstream comics, just going off on some of Marvel's biggest titles. And this is going to lead to kind of a couple of years of salad days. Basically, until almost everybody I just mentioned quits to form a rival company, life is good at Marvel. Right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I guess that is true here, isn't it?
Thank heavens for Byrne and Simonson. But other than that, it's interesting because you can kind of see how these guys are all now tucking into these big books, starting to do some cool stuff. And like the Jim Lee X-Men years, stuff that people just love. Gambit comes in, and a lot of these other characters that end up being beloved are sort of spotlighted and the like. These are some really interesting years for Wolverine, for the mutants. I really liked what Simonson did with the Fantastic Four. I thought he kind of brought back some cool sort of energy to that had been gone for a while. So 1990, yes, there's a bunch of stuff, but if you look at just the high level, it's a lot of fun at Marvel this year. They're doing some really, really interesting stuff.
It would seem like it, because it seems like every one of those creators on those books are known for this series,
for doing that book.
Yeah, for doing that book. Yeah, so
yeah. Actually, I think you're right, because that is correct. They are these are their books. So 1990 is the thing. Now, that wouldn't mean they were without completely any problems.
Right.
Our man Jackson Butch Geiss ended up getting Marvel sued, which is kind of interesting. So I think we talked about this when we were doing the Doctor Strange movie review, actually. But because we might have read some of these books.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that Geiss actually was doing a cover for a Doctor Strange comic. And when he did it, he needed a photo reference for Doctor Strange's girlfriend, a character named Morgana Blessing, who was going to be in the story. And when he was looking for a reference, he found a picture of Amy Grant, who's a Christian sort of pop singer.
Yes, I remember
and
this now.
He used that as his reference, which was not that unusual back in the day that artists would do a swipe like that. Most people would think of it as kind of a weird little homage or something like this. But Amy Grant's representatives, because she is a Christian singer, did not like the idea of her sort of being associated with the occult and all of this sort of stuff. And so they sent kind of a cease and desist against Marvel and said, what are you going to do about this? And what Marvel did about this is essentially they settled pretty quickly, buried that cover to the point where it's never been reprinted. And if you go out and look on Marvel Unlimited at that issue, instead of having the face in the background of the issue like it does on the original comic, it's just sort of a blank area now. It's a really terrible looking cover on Marvel Unlimited, but that's because it's been hacked to pieces.
Sure.
So, yeah, but so that's kind of interesting. They did get in a little bit of trouble, and we got a couple other books that were interesting. Miller returned to Marvel one last time. We talked about this earlier, at least for now. This is the last time he's worked on Elektra, I believe, up until now, with a book called Elektra Lives Again. And this is one that does not have Klaus Janson doing the inks or finishes or anything like this. This is just mainlined Frank Miller artwork with Lynn Varley on the colors. I sent you the file. Have you looked at this at all yet?
I had not had a chance to download.
All right. So it is basically like his Sin City artwork, only it's Elektra instead. It's got a lot of the same sorts of vitality and energy, and it also is incredibly violent and sort of a little bit disturbing sometimes. It's a very unusual story to have mainline Marvel characters in it, because both Daredevil and Elektra appear in this. And it is not on Marvel Unlimited, and never will be on Marvel Unlimited, because there is nudity and violence that is well beyond what is allowed on the sort of PG-13-ishness of that app. So, such is the way. But, yeah. So this is one that I did not get this at the time. I wasn't able to find a copy, so I just actually read it for the first time this week, getting ready for this podcast. And maybe some of you love this, and if it's one of your favorite Frank Millers, I apologize. But for me, it did not really connect. I didn't love it. So, but in any case, other things. New Warriors debut. New Warriors is kind of a super team for the 90s that Marvel wanted. It's led by Night Thrasher, who's kind of like this guy with a skateboard, because everybody who's cool in the 90s had a skateboard, Marvel figured, and so they had to have a guy with a skateboard. That said, it actually kind of worked. Written by Fabian Nicieza, originally drawn by Mark Bagley, this actually became one of Marvel's more popular titles of the 90s, and kind of an underrated storyline that is much beloved by a lot of folks who were younger readers during the 90s. So, especially the first, I think, 2 to 3 years of it are actually some pretty darn good comics, actually. Some good superhero comics. So if you've never read New Warriors, and you're thinking Elektra Lives Again or New Warriors, I would recommend going with New Warriors.
Right.
Even if you're a Daredevil fan. No, okay. Not if you're a Daredevil fan. If you're a Daredevil fan, if you can track down Elektra Lives Again, you should read it, because it does have a lot of context in it. Things happen. So.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about new series. These are not the limited stuff or one shots. What are some that lasted 12 issues or more?
So we had a bunch of them. Spider-Man, of course, the McFarlane Spider-Man, ended up going an even 100 issues. The new Ghost Rider, starring Danny Ketch, became one of the most popular books of the 90s as well. And that's kind of in that Midnight Suns kind of vein. That went 94 issues. New Warriors went 75 before it was done. X-Men Classic came out this year. It went 65 issues. The new Guardians of the Galaxy that Valentino started off went 62. Namor the Submariner that Byrne started also went 62. We had a new Master Edition of the Marvel Handbook that went for 3 years. Clive Barker's Nightbreed for a little over 2 years. RoboCop made it 23 issues. Marvel Superheroes, which I think was kind of either a reprint one or more of a kids one, went 15. Zorro went 12, and Stalkers went 12. So actually, there's more books that debuted this year that lasted a year or two than I think we've had in a while. So this is a really good year for sort of sticking the landing for Marvel books.
All right, so let's talk about limited series because I'm looking at this list, and this list of books here of limited titles, so that had a finite run, presumably from the start, or
Yep.
these are graphic novels, and there's over a page of these, and we're talking like multiple columns for this page with all these titles. Dan, how many
Yes.
titles are there? There's got to be like 75 or so titles here.
I believe that was correct. I think it was, yeah, I think it's around 80, something like that.
Okay.
It's ridiculous. But nonetheless, a lot of them, again, like, Daredevil Marked for Death, for instance, is actually a reprint. So that goes in and reprints some of, again, the old Frank Miller stories. So this is not necessarily new stuff. It's going to be, um, older stuff that they've now decided to bring out and do another review, another pass on.
Right.
There's Excalibur, Weird World 3 was kind of more of a premium bound one. You had a lot of these like Fantastic Four versus the X-Men type things, which were weird crossovers to try and just get some more exposure for the two of them. New Mutants Demon Bear Saga, again, as a reprint. When I look at these, probably a quarter of them are reprints. A number of them are graphic novels, and most of the rest of them are what I would best call unremarkable. So
Okay.
I think Thanos Quest might have been cool. Street Poet Ray and Steel Down was interesting. People said, I haven't read it. Steel Town Rockers was really good. Um, there's a bunch of RoboCop stuff, so those are potentially interesting. New Mutant Summer Special was really interesting. That one I liked. Black Knight series was interesting. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs was interesting. That Alien Legion on the Edge. So there were things in here that I read and liked. But overall, I think for the first time in a number of years, it was the long running series, like the actual existing series and the new continuing series, that were the ones that Marvel hit with. And a lot of these mini-series were really underwhelming.
Okay. So what does that mean as far as new characters? If we had 186 titles, we have all these books. What are we talking with regards to new characters? Is there some memorable characters that were introduced in 1990?
I mean, the weird thing is the answer is yes, but. So the problem is that a lot of the most interesting characters are actually second generation characters. Because we're going to have people like, the Danny Ketch Ghost Rider is probably one of the biggest characters, but he's actually the second Ghost Rider.
Okay.
You've got Deathlock 3, so the third version of Deathlock to come out. You've got the second version of Whiplash to come out. So again, what I think is interesting is that more and more, you don't have a lot of people who are giving their great characters to Marvel. And even if they do need to make a new character, the plan seems to be to take a name that the trademark's already used on and then recycle an idea with that character rather than make a new one. And now that could be because they don't want to give up their ideas to Marvel. And it could potentially be because the editors or the overall policy is saying, we've got too many character names to worry about already. If you want somebody who's got a big whip, just bring back Whiplash from the dead and give him a slightly different origin, or give the uniform to somebody else. And that way they can kind of continue to build on a brand that's existed for 30 years instead of starting over, So, I mean, Ghost Rider's been that way forever. The first Ghost Rider was a guy on a motorcycle who was a reboot of a guy on a horse, right? Because
Yeah.
the first Marvel Universe Ghost Rider actually is kind of a reboot of one of the guys from out of the Westerns. And then they
Yeah.
continue onward now with additional generations of those. So I think probably the number one guy to come out this year is Gambit. That is our biggest character of the new ones.
See Cable on the list as well.
Did we talk about him last week though?
We may
I think Cable was right on the edge, so he might have appeared in my query both years. But Cable would definitely be a big one if indeed he's not on there. The Mutant Liberation Front had a bunch of new characters, some of whom, like Strife, would go on to be important. New Warriors had a group called the Psionics that they faced off against. So overall, though, there were a bunch of new characters, like the supporting cast for the new Ghost Rider and stuff like that, but not. I guess Bliss maybe is another one of the X-Men characters. But as far as anybody who would be like highlighting a Marvel movie or something, really you've got only potentially one if Gambit now finally gets his movie, right? We'll see.
All right, so what about series ending? We had all these titles. Were there some books that ended this year that had been going for a little while or weren't on the limited run that ended up ending the run?
Very, very few. Really, when we look at it, I mean, technically, Classic X-Men ended, but that's only because they changed the name. So if you look at it, it'll say it ended it there, but really it continues on under X-Men Classic. Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja, ended. Punisher Magazine, both of those at 16 issues. Destroyer ended at 9, and something called Interface ended at 8. None of those were particularly main Marvel Universe stuff. And Punisher Magazine and Destroyer, I think, were both magazines. I did not like Nth Man at all. And Interface was interesting, but not something that was particularly well loved, I don't think. So the idea, though, is they started a lot of series this year and they ended very few. And so that's going to bode poorly if you're hoping on things getting more reasonable next year, by the way.
Yeah, okay.
The math is looking bad for 1991 right now.
So I don't even know what to think about what the bullpen must look like at this point. And I can only imagine the search query for number of creators this year was actually through the roof.
It broke. I was unable to actually get a query that gave me my query that came back was something like 600, and I don't believe that's actually correct. So because of that, I'm going to say that in actual fact, it is not what we thought it was. So nonetheless, it's a busy time. You've got all of these young guys. You know, the fact that you've got all of the image creators there and the like, there's a lot of energy at Marvel right now. And a lot of new people who've been coming in. The weird thing is that even as a lot of these third-party publishers have died down and Shooter is gone, you don't have as many of the classic old creators coming back as you might have thought. You know? You don't see a bunch of Gene Colan and, you know, these sorts of guys returning to Marvel right now. They're mostly camped out at DC and perfectly happy because DC's treating them well, or they've just sort of dropped out of the market because they're getting older. And so I think the main thing about the Marvel bullpen right now is it seems to be really, really young. Yeah. So really what's going on, Tom DeFalco continues to be the editor-in-chief. He's bringing new people in. He has a strong policy of trying not to totally alienate them. So even when like John Byrne gets angry at him, instead of quitting the company, he just goes over and works on a different comic book instead, right? So they haven't had a lot of real blow-ups and the like. DeFalco seems to be doing a nice job of kind of managing the expectations of his new bosses and the expectations of his staff, and is just putting out comic books that are succeeding beyond really anybody's expectation in the market. So I had not thought of Tom DeFalco as being a particularly important or like successful editor-in-chief. But to be quite frank, I think that you have to say that he sort of shepherded Marvel through one of its potentially most dangerous and creative times, you know. probably the thing that's going to get him is he's still also there and is the guy that decides not to pay all the guys who go and leave for Image. But outside of that, right now,
Sure.
I think he'd be looking at, man, I'm going to be looked at as one of the best editor-in-chiefs in the history of Marvel. So, there you go.
All right, so let's talk about rookies of the year. Who are the new people coming in, and who gets the coveted title of Rookie of the Year for 1990?
So, there's a bunch of people who came in. We had, again, about another 150 new people. Of those, I would say that probably there's 4 that I want to talk about. One of them is Dale Keown, who worked for Marvel for quite a long time. He did some of those Ant-Man books. He worked on Incredible Hulk. He's worked on a bunch of other stuff. He is not somebody who created a lot of characters and the like, but he's done some Avengers books I really liked and everything else. I think he's someone who we should mention. Ron Mars is actually a really interesting fellow because he's a writer and has been writing books for Marvel and for other folks for a long, long time. So he did a lot of Silver Surfer stuff. And in fact, he's even been coming back now and continuing series he did in the 90s with Marvel in the Now. So he's written a ton of stuff, both for Marvel and for DC. He also has his own series. He's worked on things like Witchblade and the like. So I would say that really the big thing with him is, as usual, he is going to be somebody who worked at a bunch of different companies. He's done a lot of work for Marvel, but not really enough that you'd consider him the Rookie of the Year. He also, by the way, has the sort of black mark on his career that he's the guy who wrote the stories that originally had Green Lantern's girlfriend stuffed in a refrigerator that became the actual source material for Gail Simone's Women in Refrigerators sort of idea in terms of how women in comics are often made to suffer to put the plots of their male sort of like boyfriends and husbands forward. So, yeah, he probably doesn't send her Christmas cards. So
Sure.
It's not.
All right, so who else do we have on this list then?
Jimmy Palmiotti, who we are going to see a lot of. So Palmiotti and Amanda Conner are one of the power couples in comics. They have been drawing and writing and working on books for Marvel and DC and their own stuff for a long time. I would say Amanda Conner is probably one of my 2 or 3 all-time favorite comic artists. Her stuff is just so clean and fun, and it is like a combination of almost like a Neil Adams does Dan DeCarlo type of thing, where it's cartoony, which he was a big like Archie artist. So if you think of like superheroes, but with a little bit of that really comic-y flair,
Gotcha. Okay.
Connor's just fantastic. But Palmiotti is no slouch either. He in fact is a fantastic writer and artist who's worked a lot on Daredevil. And so as we get a little farther on here, we are going to see a run that he does that's going to be something that is actually one of my favorite Daredevil runs of all time. So remember that name. I don't think, again, that he's done enough stuff for Marvel to necessarily be the guy here because he's worked a lot of different places. He actually, in fact, founded his own company and then sort of sublet out a lot of the Marvel Knights stuff to Marvel. So it's almost like Marvel hired a production company to do a Marvel Knights imprint, which had a lot of stuff, including some of the Daredevil in it. And they kind of worked through that and did it. Leading to Quesada eventually coming on and becoming a bigwig with Marvel. And then Palmiotti sort of went off and did his own thing instead. The last person, though, who I think pretty much has to be the actual winner for this one, is Tom Brevoort, who, if you've ever kind of been a fan of comics history or you're somebody who's out on the internet looking for information and the like, Brevoort has been an editor and sort of just a person at Marvel for a fantastically long time. And he's a really, really important sort of ambassador for Marvel and for comics and everything else. He has edited New Avengers, Civil War, Fantastic Four, turned into an executive editor for Marvel in 2007, eventually became senior vice president of publishing, and as of now, he's actually the group editor for all the X-Men books. So he started at Marvel as an intern in 1989 and has never left. And over the last, 35 years, he has really sort of shepherded through all sorts of stuff in the Marvel Universe.
Yeah,
and so
I'll say.
He's not somebody who's created a bunch of characters or drawn a bunch of pages or written a bunch of stuff, but just as somebody who has been around for a long time and just seems to be this steadying force, I think he is low-key one of the most important figures at Marvel over the last few decades. It's actually that... even on his Wikipedia page, it says that Pop first commented, "It's hard to underestimate the influence Tom Brevoort has had on the modern era of Marvel, be it Marvel Comics, Marvel Studios, or Marvel bedsheets even." He is a guy who has seen it all, and I'm going to definitely give him the Rookie of the Year because some people just get it because they've done exceptional work and moved up the ladder forever, and obviously have made a mark on the company.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Tom Brevoort.
Yeah, I was going to say that name looked familiar to me, and I think it's in movie credits. I think it's on Civil War, all that. Seems like his name has been on a lot of Marvel stuff through the years, so it makes sense that he would be the Rookie of the Year for this year.
Yeah, he's their longest serving editor, and he's worked with just about everybody. And I really don't think you can underestimate how important just the fact that he is out in the community answering questions and sort of being willing to sort of help explain what's going on at Marvel and stuff in the community is. He's just always been a really accessible part of the Marvel Universe. And he knows everything.
Yeah.
So that helps.
There you go. That does. All right, we're almost to Daredevil, but before we do that, Dan, what was your favorite Marvel comic in 1990?
So it's kind of hilarious, but I'm going to go with a reprint for the most part. Classic X-Men / X-Men Classic actually was at this point my favorite comic. And this goes back to the fact that when I started reading Marvel Comics, I did not immediately have access to all of the old Claremont, Byrne, or Cockrum stuff from the beginning. And I rediscovered a lot of that through Classic X-Men. Beautiful thing is it would reprint all of these old stories that were now super expensive that I didn't have the money to buy. And then it would also have at the back like a John Bolton drawn little vignette that was kind of an additional story that tied into that reprint. So you were still getting new X-Men story. You got a beautiful Art Adams cover, which was always worth the price almost of itself. And then you got to actually fill in. So I maybe had a third or half of those old X-Men issues by the 90 time, when these were coming out. But this way I could read all of them. And I didn't anymore have to try and dig through and figure out what had happened in some of those early ones. Which, this was before the internet. This was before trade paperbacks. This was before there was any way to actually find out what happened in those stories, except to actually go and track down those old comic books. And then pay whatever exorbitant prices people wanted for them. So these were a brilliant thing.
That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments at comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.